All right, welcome back to the program. Let's get started with our conversation. Luca Moneta is the senior economist at Alliance, is in charge of Africa and Middle East. Hello, Luca. Thank you for joining us from Milan. That's
Hi,
the
Nancy. Hi,
hi,
Nancy.
hi, Milan, Italy.
Thanks
That's
for
the
hosting me.
yes, the fashion and design capital of Italy. So welcome to the program. Um, Luca, let's get started. Let me get your views on what you've seen has been happening in Africa, at least sub-Saharan Africa, in the last few months. Here in Nigeria, we have a new presidency in place, a new government in place. Earlier on, I also mentioned what's been happening in Egypt. We've also seen that currency depreciation has been impacting many African countries on the continent. So as we get started, let me just have your sentiments in like a minute and we'll take it from there.
Yep, thank you. I'd seen two separate shocks that merged in recent months. The first one is, of course, the impact of inflation and interest rates. We know that sovereign debt in Africa has come under stress in the past years, and also the capability of governments to refinance debt has deteriorated. Um, so lots of reports came out talking about that. We can now say that around 57% of the population in Africa, which is around 750 million inhabitants, live in countries where interest repayments are higher than on the government budget than what the government can spend on health and education. So this has increased dramatically in the past decade. So just to have an idea, the overall expenditure on education has decreased. Expenditure on health increased by 6%, but we also have to take into account that the pandemic had a very, very huge impact on that. And the other side is, again, subsidies. So how the cost of living and in general disposable income have deteriorated in the past 12 months. And this has also to do with the increase of oil price and in general of commodity prices following the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And that for Nigeria is, again, another interesting and dramatic at the same time story. So we can look into that in great detail. But in general, I'd say this cluster of particularly lower middle income economies have been impacted the most in recent years and are suffering the most now. They are countries such as Nigeria, such as Ghana, Kenya, that have been allowed to contract commercial debts and expand, of course, because there are infrastructure needs, there are spending needs, and this is pretty okay. At the same time, you have also had an amelioration of living standards and the resilience under these shocks of living standards and private consumption, which is, for instance, for when it comes to Nigeria, is the largest contributor to GDP growth. Um, the the resilience of these factors is still to be tested.
Luca, why do you think that the issue of energy subsidy, in this case fuel, now, why do you think is such a challenging issue for sub-Saharan African countries? That's been going on for many years. Why do you think that this continues to be a very sticky issue?
Yeah, yeah. Well, particularly for some countries, again, Nigeria, for instance, if we take the amount that the government spends on fuel subsidies, it is one quarter of the total revenues. So this is just to give an idea. Again, I know you are very, very familiar with these proportions, but these proportions have largely increased in past years on, I'd say, two main drivers. The first one is the demographic. Um, Fortunately, African countries are growing, have a positive dividend when it comes to demographic, but that also brings more consumption on the one side. On the other side, this pressure, particularly from costs and from the devaluation of currencies, or the real, let's say, fair values of currencies, have also an impact. So the state has, and governments have mitigated these effects. So just to again to make it say more Nigeria specific, for instance, the contribution by the government to the fuel subsidy is around $50 per inhabitant. So that's, and if we also take into account that around half of Nigeria's population is below, or is younger than 18 years old, which is basically the median age, you can also well calculate that each Nigerian below 18 years old has $100 less of government contribution when it comes to school, for instance, so education. Of course, the direction that these cut subsidies will take. So, I mean, they're not spending more on subsidies, so they can spend more on health and education. So, if these subsidies are redirected in these directions, the effect is not as long term as one could expect, and the benefits will bear their fruits soon.
Luca, I would like to get your views about subsidies in general, because it seems even the way that African countries take a look at subsidies seems that the word subsidy is such a bad word or a bad term for government, from government to the people. Are subsidies generally bad? For instance, Italy, where you are, I know there are various types of subsidies. There are even subsidies for even olive millers, for example. There are subsidies even for food, millions, hundreds of millions of euros for food. There are different subsidies for different industries apart from agriculture. So why is it that when it comes to Africa, for example, for African countries that are blessed with mineral resources like Nigeria, Angola, even Ghana, removed all subsidies, the West, or even people like the World Bank, analysts like you and all others will say, oh, subsidy is bad. It's not good. It's not nice. You guys should take it away. It's depressing the revenues and all of that. This idea of subsidies, can you speak to me this morning about if subsidies are generally bad?
Hmm. That's a very good question. Thanks for that, Nancy, because also allows me to say that economists also have a stomach, and we also, I mean, tend to refer to subsidies with again the kind of probably prejudice you are also highlighting now. So yeah, I agree with you. Living standards have deteriorated, and the state has to take into account for that. And this is probably the hardest time in years to decide to remove subsidies on the one end. On the other, it must also be taken into account that, for instance, when it comes to Nigeria, if we look at what is the share of oil and gas revenues in terms of government revenues, so into the budget, these are historically around 3.5% of GDP. So that gives you also a measure of how such an important sector on the one end, when it comes to revenues and export receipts, where this money goes. So if you are the government and you earn 3 or 3.5% of GDP based only on oil and gas activities, and again, very crucial activities for the economy, then you have to spend on the other side around 2.5% of GDP in oil subsidies. That gives you an idea of how imbalanced the trade is in this sector for the country. So it's not a matter of, again, assisting, giving, supporting the population, because this is definitely something that has to remain. So targeted subsidies, targeted transfers are definitely fundamental in this phase. But on the other side, you see how the overall, say, balance of incomes and outcomes are definitely affecting the Nigerian economy in that sense.
So, Luca, I don't know if I actually got an answer to my question. Are subsidies generally bad? I don't know if I heard your answer.
I'd say that subsidies are generally bad, but if we agree that, for instance, we have a short inflation, even if it is sticky, just like this one, we also have to put in place some kind of subsidy, some kind of transfer to mitigate the situation. So subsidies are not bad in the short term. They tend to be stickier than inflation and bad in the long term because they are very, very difficult then to be removed when economic conditions change, which is probably the case of this time. So we are observing, for instance, when it comes to the deterioration of cost of living and inflation in general, two different dynamics also. So one is the short-term dynamic of inflation, so high commodity prices, currency depreciation, and so on. These add to the short-term perception of inflation, and this is one thing. These in that sense, these factors can be redressed, can be mitigated using subsidies, and this is perfectly good. On the other side, we have other dynamics, we have other factors that tend to increase inflationary pressures. And whatever subsidy helps in that direction supports greater inflation and probably directs private consumption, private spending towards our other directions, which are probably less beneficial to the overall economy. These subsidies are bad.
Mm. Okay, Luca, you're putting me in a difficult position, so to speak, as to where do I come from in terms of my questioning. You're saying, if I got you right, that subsidies are not bad if it's short term, but they're bad
Yeah.
if it's on the long term, and it becomes more challenging if that economy or that country is facing, economic challenge like we have in Nigeria and other African countries. So, what would you call, even if a country is not passing through any economic challenge, perhaps in times of economic boom, and the country reels out policies to support the poor in their country, and that is also subsidy. For instance, in the US, you have food stamps. I think in the UK, there are council flats. Even in the US, you have unemployment for people that are not working. The government gives them monies every month and all of that. What would you call that? These are even rich countries, let alone poor countries. For instance, in Nigeria, we have 133 million multidimensionally poor people. In Ghana, you have poor people there. In Africa, you have many poor people across Africa. For rich countries to be doing that, and for poor countries not to have a semblance of welfare, some semblance of subsidy, that the poor will see that as the only thing that they are gaining from the government. What would you call that?
No, sure. I get your point. I would say that targeted subsidies are, I mean, definitely preferable to these kind of horizontal subsidies. So if you are going to the pump to refill your tank for your car, for your motorbike, uh, I mean, this kind of subsidy is generally spread over the population. Disregard the fact that you have um, a certain income or a much lower income or no income at all. So these kind of subsidies, again, if you remove them, it is, I mean, you are in the short term damaging the overall population, so horizontally, but keeping them in place also is detrimental for particularly for those who have less, for the poor segments of the population. Because again, this money is money that the government is spending, and is spending this money to the benefit of the general population, not looking into the details if they are poor, if they are not, if they could afford that or not, and so on. So I understand it's a very, say, dramatic phase. And you mentioned, for instance, energy, so electricity generation. This is also having an impact on electricity generation for sure, given again the peculiarities of countries. But on the other side, um, if I were, say, a poor family, knowing that this money is going to subsidize horizontally the purchase of fuel rather than, say, the education of my children or health expenses, that would be probably more detrimental to my personal and familiar development than a generalized subsidy on fuel. So for instance, the transfers you mentioned to population that have no work or are basically working poor, these have a rationale behind, whereas having a kind of horizontal subsidy to the overall population, particularly on a segment where you have also some sources of revenues, just like oil, crude oil and natural gas, is probably more detrimental.
Okay, Luca, who actually benefits from these subsidies? Because for the case of Nigeria, for example, what we've seen in the last few weeks and even before then, that the elites will come on television, even across the media, even analysts, and say, oh, the subsidy benefits the poor, it benefits the rich, rather, that we should take away the subsidy. But the events of the last few days have shown us otherwise, that the economics is a bit of a different economics, because there are also transmission effects, there are pass-through mechanisms, that the removal of the subsidy is impacting on the poor. The World Bank said, I think about a month ago or so, that if nothing is done, in the case of Nigeria, 7 more million Nigerians will be pushed into poverty. So you take a look now at the removal of fuel subsidy, the poor is getting the brunt more than even the rich, because it's only the rich now that can seemingly afford fuel in their vehicles, even though they are saying they are crying, that is affecting them. The rich also cry. So who really benefits from these energy subsidies? Do you think that perhaps in the case of Nigeria, perhaps in the case of other African countries, that we've looked at the economics of this all subsidies well? Vis-a-vis that, these are countries that are blessed with these resources. Perhaps the pass-through effects of not refining in their countries are also making these subsidies higher, as well as perhaps the corruption in the subsidy transmission mechanism.
Sure. On the one side, as you mentioned, having a kind of a refining industry helps, definitely. And so the state is basically covering from the lack of it at the national level on the one side. On the other side, as you said, it is definitely true that rich, or say the highest percentiles of the population, those that can, as you say, seemingly afford the increase in fuel prices, were probably say treated too well before. So it is definitely true, as you said, that you need some other kind of subsidies, some other kind of transfer to mitigate the impact of it. So this is particularly true when you have a population, again, where half of the population is probably too young to work, but still need to be fed, and their families also have higher costs to. So this is definitely true. On the other side, again, it has also to do with the kind of society, the kind of community you have in mind. So how you are responding to the overall transitions, redressing the kind of benefit, the kind of subsidies, the kind of benefits you are you are offering to the population. So again, this is why probably an horizontal subsidy like fuel subsidy is less able to work efficiently to redress this situation, and why one could argue that this situation is probably increasing social fatigue and, in general, the risk of social unrest, because this is, you are basically fueling that if you just remove the subsidy and you don't redirect this money toward the poor segments of the population. So this is definitely true, and we have seen that in recent months. For instance, we took into account since 2020 till today how correlated is the increase in inflation in Nigeria, for instance, and the increase in social unrest. So this is positively correlated, meaning that, again, if inflation increases, the risk of social tensions also increase. And this also gives you an idea of, say, how little these subsidies have actually done in terms of mitigating pensions and in terms of really helping out families, those who need the most. I mean, and what we saw in actually in recent months is that it is kind of unusual stability given the current economic conditions. So this is also something that made us wonder if the current conditions are probably too harsh even to protest, because you need to and at the end of the day to find other sources of revenues or reduce your costs, and you probably have less time to organize and protest. So this is also a dynamic that is detrimental. So and this is something we are really monitoring. So all in all, let's say that again the removal of the subsidy per se shouldn't be as negative as if it were also be mitigated by the introduction of other measures that are targeted to help the poor uh, face the current situation.
Mm. Um, Luca, thank you for bringing one aspect that I didn't even think about earlier, and thank you for highlighting that, which is that if you have majority of a population that are not working, perhaps they are not also in the working age, or they are young not to work. And in the case of Nigeria, for example, Nigeria's median age is 18. So for a child of 18, or an adult is an adult from, at least the Nigerian term, is from 18. So 18 is supposedly should be in school. So thank you for highlighting that, because when you said that, oh, it just clicked. So how does it now what does it leave the government to do in this case? If you take a look at Africa, which you cover in your organization, Africa is a youthful continent. It's a continent of many young people, has the largest youth in the world. So where does it put African governments in terms of, okay, we're seeing energy reforms across African continents. How should they look at this in terms of, perhaps, if you're taking out subsidy, what are you giving us in return to avoid the social unrest which you mentioned? Because
Exactly.
if the governments are not able to do this quickly and the population see that the government is sincere, it might ignite social unrest. So where does it leave the government? How should the government take a look at it? Like in Nigeria, for example, yesterday our National Economic Council did put together recommendations. I know the analysts have been looking at it, if it's okay, if it's not okay. But what do you think that African governments should begin to do right now, especially for countries like Egypt, Nigeria, Ghana on one side is also suffering very seriously?
Yeah, exactly. This is also something cause a reason for concern for us as Alliance in general, because we also, I mean, I'm very interested in seeing what the demographic dynamic is, and particularly how we can support in terms of um, enabling higher quality and higher distribution of education. This is also really important, and this is why again I was calculating that the removal of the subsidy should free up to $100 for each Nigerian living, well, whose age is 18 or below. This money, again, is definitely crucial that is spent in, say, health and education systems, for instance, because you don't want, I mean, on the one side, you have large demographic increase. On the other side, you also want that these people are skilled and come out of school having learned something and having been able to enter the job market with many more skills, or with the capacity to adapt to changes in the labor market and so on. So, and not to basically go away, for instance, and find a job in other countries, because that is also impoverishing your economy, or because they maybe want some higher, say, health and education, insurance, and pension schemes that are probably not given in Nigeria or in other lower middle income countries in Africa. So this is the other side of the story. So this is where, again, you should concentrate on what kind of society, what kind of community you have in mind, and how to best redirect this money that you are taking away from subsidies that are going just to, again, fuel subsidies, into some other form of subsidies or into some other form of transfers from the government to education systems, for instance.
Okay, let's talk about the impact of global inflation on SSA countries. For instance, Nigeria's inflation came out for June at 22.79%. If you take a look at Ghana at the time, Ghana's inflation hit 52%. Egypt is oscillating around 35 to 36% inflation. I can go on and on. Do you think that African economies have been able to handle the impact of Russia-Ukraine's war and still handling it well in terms of inflation management from their various central banks or from their reserve banks, as the case may be? Do you think it would have been worse than this, or we're handling it well, or could we have handled it better, since Africa is also an agrarian continent?
Yep. Yeah, and full of peculiarities, let's say. But one general pattern we are observing is that, for instance, food prices on globally are now not increasing as much as we are seeing in Africa, for instance. And this has to do, of course, with the supply chain, with the way you transport and you keep, for instance, the cold chain and networks and so on. So that has to do with many aspects that Africa, where Africa is probably less equipped to face with such a scarcity economy on the one side. And so this is on the other side, you have these monetary policies that are being implemented. And this is probably for some of the countries you mentioned, just like Egypt, for instance, Tunisia, to some extent also Kenya. These are probably the only lever that is left to government, to states to face the ongoing conditions. But the dynamic where you see again that food prices are not increasing as much on a global scale, but they are keeping increasing, particularly in Africa. And again, aside from all the peculiarities that each country has, but this is telling of a situation where it's not purely a monetary level that will change things, and you have lots of suffering among the population. So this is probably again why you should and.
Luca, are you still there? Can you hear me?
Rather than buyers, so
Okay.
To companies rather than households. And there is this debate on whether this is fair and how long will it take to have these incentives passed through the population. So having these incentives that really allow for greater productivity, greater quantities of food, and then also have a kind of deflationary or at least less inflationary impact for when it comes to food and staples. So this is definitely interesting. And on the other side is telling of a situation where you have long-lasting effects of these shocks, and you have to rebuild your supply chain. Also consider again where you source your essential goods from. So in the case of fuel, where you are sourcing fuel from, you are an oil producer, but you don't have enough, say, refined fuel capacity. And again, that also applies to other sectors. And that causes trade imbalances and so on. So these trade imbalances, particularly given the current circumstances, are probably affecting Africa the most compared to other countries.
So, in essence, what you're saying is that Africa's central banks in Africa, or even reserve banks in Africa, that raising interest rates alone would not solve the problem of inflation, if I heard you right, especially even in the case of Nigeria and even in other climes. Anytime interest rates is raised, we see that inflation also goes higher. In South Africa, I think it was yesterday that the Reserve Bank kept rates unchanged at about 10, is it 10.25% or 8.25 percent. Nigeria's MPC meeting, I think, will be held next week. So we'll also need to see the movement of the Central Bank of Nigeria in terms of will it continue to raise interest rates. Though at the beginning of this year, we were giving that signal. Not even this year. Last year, the central bank signaled that they will continue to raise interest rates until they see a tapering down of inflation. Now, if we move over to this other aspect in terms of revenues for African countries, how do you think that we have really done? We've been talking about fuel subsidies. Fuel subsidies have been depressing revenues of many African countries. How do you think that we can, address this issue of increased revenues despite the economic headwinds that various African countries are facing?
Yep. Again, it is true that government revenues are lower, also compared to emerging markets on average, and low income countries particularly. So this is definitely one field where African governments could do more in the sense of digitalizations, for instance, and the ability to collect money, but also to benefit more from the quantity and variety of resources that are now eyed with increasing interest by the North, by the global North. This is one aspect of the story. On the other side, it is also important to keep advantage of the current conditions in terms of financing, and so once for instance, the U.S. Federal Reserve and central banks in the West have reduced their impulse to tightening, which is probably happening sooner than what we expect. The response, the monetary response, should also be important. So there are segments of there are some analysts and commentators that argue that, for instance, that the buffers in local banks should also be decreased to allow banks to give more and more stimulus.
Okay.
Which is, and you should decide. I mean, which side you want to privilege. If you want to privilege the real economy, you should then lower your buffer and allow banks to lend more money to households and small and medium companies on the one side. On the other side, again, the interest rate trap is still there. So you should again decide to lend money wisely, because otherwise people won't be able to repay for that. Okay. If you make it available. So this is another very interesting dynamic. Yeah.
Okay, Luca, just one last question for you just before we go, and I would hope that you can answer that in less than 2 minutes. Let's take a look at the African economies. 40% of African economies facing devaluation. We've seen different currencies being devalued and also continuous depreciation. Do you think that our central banks have really done enough in terms of exchange rate management? Because that is also part of their core duty. I mentioned earlier the Reserve Bank of South Africa keeping interest rates now, in this case, at 8.25% yesterday. Then the other part I want you to comment on, the quest from BRICS countries now, perhaps to use the yuan as another exchange rate and not just the dollar, using the dollar that has been the world's reserve currency. What do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, we estimated that again, 40% of African countries on GDP. So 40% of African GDP has been affected by severe depreciation in the past year. So this is dramatic. And so the role of central banks, particularly in Africa, is very debated and challenged. Also because they have to face three different drivers. One is again currency devaluation, but the other one is the capacity um, uh, to to um, to get money to basically finance government activities. And this is also the dynamic you have seen in Nigeria in recent years. Uh, you basically increase the interest rate or keep interest rates particularly high because you need liquidity, you need money, and so to finance the government and mitigate the effect of the fiscal balance, the deterioration in the fiscal balance, and the other aspect is as a source of revenue for the banking sector itself, because it
Okay.
is largely the largest way to fund for their operations. And
Okay.
again, to come to your question
Very quickly,
on
Luca,
BRICS.
we've got to go. Yes. Very quickly, in 10
Okay,
seconds, if you can.
sorry.
Yes.
Uh, there is, of course, this say tendency towards diversifying the currency portfolio on the one end. On the other end, I think it is tricky because the situation is not going away that fast
Okay.
with such a measure.
Okay. Thank you very much, Luca. Let's talk again soon. Thank you very much and have a great
Thank
day.
you.
All
Thank
right.
you, likewise.
All right. I've been speaking with Luca Moneta, who is the senior economist at Alliance in charge of Africa and the Middle East. That's the much we can take on today's edition of the program, Be the Best You Can Be and Be the Change that you want to see. Please join us again next week. I am Nancy Magic. Bye for now.